What does a famine sound like? It's quieter than you'd think. No riots, no shouts, only the coughs of the fevered and the slow crumble of cottages as families slip away. Tonight, we step into that silence, into the lives of those who woke each morning praying for even one good potato. Before the soup kitchens, before the ships, before help ever came, what did survival mean when even the tiniest scrap of food was unattainable? Welcome back everyone, so glad to see you again. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a thumbs up, comment where you're tuning in from, and what your dream is in life. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy this stroll through history. The morning starts quietly, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that feels unnatural, as if even the birds are waiting for someone else to move first. You step outside with the spade still damp from yesterday's digging, expecting the bright smell of wet earth and the sight of the green tops poking up through soft soil. Instead, there's a heaviness in the air, a damp odour that clings to your clothes. You can't place it at first. It's like rot but older, as though the fields themselves have gone bad overnight. You kneel and dig into the ground, peeling back the skin of the earth that, until yesterday, held your family's safety. The first potato turns up black and slick, the smell stronger now. You toss it aside and dig again. The second one is the same, a pale shell over a bruised interior that crumbles at a touch. The third is worse. It collapses between your fingers, leaving a foul, wet trail. The plants above still stand green and proud, mocking you. You tear one up, and the roots come away soft and lifeless. The seed you planted months ago has turned to filth. By noon, you've gone from field to field, each worse than the last. You pass other men doing the same, none of you speaking, just listening to the sound of the spade cutting into nothing worth saving. That smell, the one you couldn't name, spreads across the valley. It comes from every direction. By evening, the entire countryside reeks of decay. It makes your eyes sting. Someone mutters something about a fog the night before, something blue that clung to the fields. Nobody replies. The truth sits plain in the soil. Whatever happened, it's everywhere at once. Weeks later, people will learn to call it Phytophthora infestans, a fungus that's spread by spores in the damp weather. But for now, it's just the blight, an invisible curse that has reached into every furrow. No one saw it arrive. There were no warnings, no slow wilt to give time to react. One day, the fields promised abundance. The next, they offered nothing but rot. Abundance turned to panic almost overnight, and rumours began to turn with it. Some said it was windborne, some that it came on seed from England, and others that spirits had soured the land for sins not yet confessed. You don't have time to wonder about causes. You have rent due. Every ounce of your living, your meals, your labour, your coin, depends on the potato. It's more than food. It's the economy of the house, the measure of what you owe, and the limit of what you can give. Rent collectors don't take blight as payment, and there's no grain to fall back on. All you have to sell was grown right here in this blackened patch of dirt. That's what monoculture means in practice. When one thing dies, everything else falls with it. Inside the cottage, your wife's peeling one of the few that looks decent. She stops mid-stroke when the skin slips and the knife cuts straight through to the mush beneath. You both stare as if it might somehow mend itself if you don't speak. The youngest child cries, restless from hunger, the kind that's been building slowly for months as you've halved and quartered every meal. Tonight there's little to divide. The fire burns low. Even the peat is damp. You eat what you can salvage, pretending not to notice the aftertaste of mould. The silence stretches between bites. Tomorrow you'll go to the landlord's agent with nothing but excuses. His own barns are full of grain, you've seen the carts heading toward the ports. Britain still trades, ships still leave. The cattle and oats keep flowing out across the channel as if nothing's wrong. You could stand at the road's edge and watch the export wagons rattle past, while your children scrape at the dregs of spoiled potatoes. In a world run by commerce, hunger doesn't interrupt the schedule. The blight doesn't respect counties, classes, or prayers. It sweeps through lowland and highland alike, through Connaught and Munster, through the poorest cottier and the middling farmer. Some fields lose half their crop, others all. There's no pattern except ruin. Reports spread that in some parishes 3/4 of the harvest lies wasted within a month. The ground that once fed a family for a year now yields nothing but a stench. The destruction moves faster than news itself, a kind of rotting contagion that can't be fenced. By winter, 1/3 of the potato fields in Ireland are gone. The following year, the losses climb so high that people stop counting. 3/4 gone, maybe more. The numbers don't matter when the bowls are empty. Those who still have coins scramble to buy grain, but prices spike by the day. The country is slipping into panic. Rent can't be paid, debts go bad, and with the harvest gone, labour loses meaning. There's no work when the work is feeding on what no longer exists. Some still cling to hope that the next planting will come back strong. Others know better. Once a single season's crop holds an entire nation's weight, it doesn't take much to pull it down. What began as a sickness in the soil spreads through every layer of Irish life. The blight exposes how fragile the balance always was. A country built on small plots, on borrowed land, and on faith that the next harvest will save you. This, right here, is when that balance starts to break. And if one crop could drag a nation into despair, you have to wonder how things ever grew that dependent in the first place. How did a whole country end up living off one crop? You wake up before the sun, shoulders already sore from yesterday. The soil under your nails never really comes out anymore. There's rent due this week, and you've barely enough potatoes to pay it. The irony is cruel. You work the land every day, but you don't own a single inch of it. The landlord owns miles, maybe never steps foot here, and his agent will come soon to collect a share of your harvest, or the few coins you've scraped together. Everything you've worked for passes straight through your hands. You just try to keep enough to live on. Out here, nearly everyone is a tenant farmer or a cottier. You rent a scrap of ground, an acre if you're lucky, and the rent swallows almost all you make. The rent isn't just money either. It's labour, long hours, maybe weeks, cutting turf or mending hedges for the landlord's estate miles away. The middleman, the one standing between you and the real owner, squeezes you again for good measure. He leases big parcels from the landlord, then chops them into smaller and smaller strips until they barely hold a family's crop. The smaller the plot, the higher the rent per acre. He lives better than you ever will because your work fills his pockets too. The potato keeps this whole arrangement just barely standing. They call it the potato wage. In practice, that means food is your payment, not money. Every hour of digging, planting and harvesting buys you another meal's worth of boiled potatoes. The crop feeds your family and covers the rent, and there's rarely anything left. An acre's worth might keep 6 mouths alive through the year if the crop holds. It's efficient, yes, but it traps you. Every bite reminds you that there's nothing else in the plan. Across the hills, the big houses of the landlords gleam faintly even through the fog. 8 out of 10 acres in Ireland belong to families like theirs, most of them English or Anglo-Irish, many living comfortably across the sea in London or Bath. They collect from afar. their agents tallying numbers like a ledger of ghosts. The money leaves Ireland faster than the grain exports. They seldom spend a penny improving the land. To them, it's just an income line on a page. The Devon Commission tried to put it politely when they wrote that Irish labourers habitually and silently endure privations. You could fill whole parishes with those words. Inside your cabin, there's no need for poetry. The walls are made of mud and thatch, patched with turf to keep out the wind. The damp never leaves. It clings to the walls, your clothes, your lungs. You wake each morning to the smell of smoke and wet straw. The children sleep near the hearth, red cheeks from the heat but feet trembling in the cold air just beyond the fire's reach. If you're lucky, you have a pig rooting quietly in the corner. It's part of the rent payment when the time comes. The floor's packed earth. The roof drips when the rain turns heavy, which is often. Work starts long before daylight. You cut through coarse grass to reach the tiny patch that sustains the family. There's no machinery, no luxury, only the spade and your hands. The soil fights back, wet, uneven and filled with stones. Every motion blisters your palms. The coin you earn outside the farm, maybe as a day labourer carrying peat or harvesting someone else's crop, goes straight to the agent. When food is the currency, every meal is a paycheck. You count your survival in potatoes rather than coins. Even in good years, the arithmetic never favours you. Rent drains most of the crop. Seed potatoes take another portion. The rest must feed everyone you love. A single illness or a week of bad weather can undo it all. You always owe, never own. There's no savings, no surplus, no cushion. The British reports talk about improvement, about better methods, but improvement costs money, and money doesn't exist here. You live on credit measured not in shillings, but in mercy and luck. Absentee landlords claim their estates thrive, but the wealth flows one way. The people producing it sleep in smoke-filled cabins, wearing clothes that never fully dry. The children learn early how to dig and carry. They know not to cry when the meal gets thinner each month. They already understand something their landlords never will, that hunger doesn't ask for patience, it demands what you don't have. And still, every year, you plant again. Population keeps growing. Over 8 million people now, 2/3 of them tied to the land. Fields shrink, mouths multiply. The middlemen subdivide plots further, charging rent for pieces too small to sustain life. The system consumes itself like a snake eating its tail. Everyone knows it can't last, but no one wants to face what happens when it stops. Your entire livelihood rests on the health of one crop, in one climate, on land you don't control. By dusk, the fire in your cottage burns weak. Outside, you can hear distant laughter from the big house, where a different kind of meal is served. You chew slowly, not because you're savouring it, but because stretching the time between bites feels like eating more. The day ends as it began, with a quiet desperation that never really leaves. Even when the crops looked good, you were walking a thin line between survival and ruin. Now that same line is cracking, and as the smell of rot spreads across Ireland, everyone suddenly realises how fragile that balance truly was, how one bad harvest is enough to make the entire country starve. The silence settles first, a stillness so total it feels louder than noise. The fields that once hummed with life now stretch bare, their ridges broken and grey. The only sound left is the wind pushing through the dead stalks, brushing against the stone walls abandoned months too early. No laughter from the next house, no dogs barking, not even birds. Just the sound of air and the dull pang that never leaves your belly. You wait for something to move, anything, but there's nothing alive enough to stir the quiet. 3 weeks have passed since the potatoes truly vanished. The first days were spent searching, digging through what was left, hoping for one unspoiled row. After that, everyone began to eat whatever could be eaten. Grain meant to feed livestock ends up boiled thin into a bitter mash. Pea meal, oat husks, and bits swept up from storage bins. All of it becomes supper. The worst is when someone starts on the seed potatoes. They're meant for next year, meant to save you later, but hunger makes reason thin. Every seed cooked now means no planting later, no second chance. You argue with yourself, and then you stop arguing because arguing burns energy you can't afford to waste. The choice is simple and impossible. Eat the seed and live through the week, or keep it and risk dying before spring. In cabins across the country, families make that same decision at the same hour, most choosing the same way. When you can't feel your arms and the children cry through the night, the future doesn't weigh much against the sound of now. The pots boil down to nothing, the smoke stings your eyes, and the smell is faint, warm but empty, like something pretending to be food. As the days stretch, people start pulling up what little else might grow. Nettles from the hedgerows are boiled into dark soup, more green than flavour. Turnip tops appear in baskets at the market, wilted before they can be sold. Near the coast, families walk miles to gather shellfish, their fingers bleeding from opening them with stones. Some chew on seaweed or moss, anything they can swallow. The body doesn't protest anymore, it just takes what it's given. You start to forget the taste of bread, even the weight of real food in your stomach. You remember the act of eating, not the comfort of it. The year 1846 turns bad faster than anyone imagined possible. The blight returns stronger than before, this time claiming about 3/4 of all potato fields. The few that looked green soon melt into the same black sludge that choked last year's crop. The price of grain shoots up until it's out of reach. Any stores left from the previous season disappear, traded or stolen, sometimes guarded like treasure. The early days of hope give way to a strange kind of calm, the kind that only comes when there's no more pretending left to do. Inside each cabin, the same scene plays out. Parents breaking small pieces of food for children who can't stop asking. You take a smaller share every night. Hunger sharpens at first, then blunts into fatigue. The older ones stop eating first. They say they're not hungry, not because it's true, but because it spares a child a single mouthful more. Mothers' faces hollow, breath slowing. The babies fuss less, too tired to cry. The fire burns low because gathering turf takes energy you don't have. When the pot is empty, conversation dies. Words waste strength. Meanwhile, the road outside stays busy with wagons. Long lines carrying grain, beef and butter to the ports. You can smell the oats drifting from the sacks. It isn't meant for you. The guards and merchants keep their eyes forward, avoiding yours. Trade continues, bound by contracts more powerful than hunger. The same harbour that exports food by daylight welcomes ships at dusk, carrying Indian corn meant for relief, though it rarely reaches far enough inland to help. The contradiction is almost too much to understand. A country exporting plenty, while its people starve beside the roadside. Each passing day brings more waiting, less movement. Hunger steals everything that once filled time. Songs, stories, even worry. You lie awake, counting breaths for no real reason. Neighbours start disappearing from cabins, taken by exhaustion, or leaving for towns they think might offer work or soup. The ones who remain learn the smell of sickness before they recognise the symptoms. You can feel the fever spreading through villages that barely have the strength to bury their dead. After 3 weeks, the hunger starts to change shape. It's no longer just emptiness, it becomes illness. Malnutrition drags resistance down, and disease finds easy homes. Typhus, dysentery, fever. Names that sound distant until they're in your bed. The weakness blurs the lines between starvation and sickness. The two become the same thing. One day you wake up unable to stand, the next you wake surrounded by silence again. Someone else gone, the space beside them already cold. There's no medicine coming, not yet, only talk of plans. People say the government will step in soon, that there's talk in London of relief work and food distribution. The waiting stretches, roads fill with the faint shuffle of those still strong enough to walk. You watch them pass, their faces grey in the daylight, heading somewhere they hope holds more than wind and promises. Hunger has done its work. Now its shadow, disease, begins to take what's left. Relief finally comes, but not the kind you can live on. It arrives with rules, ledgers and spades. You're told there's work available, roads to build, stones to break, canals to dig. Payment is promised in wages so small they can't even buy a full meal. The instructions are clear. Help will be earned, not given. To get food, you have to work for it, even if your arms shake too much to lift the shovel. The irony is sharp. Help is there, but only if you can survive long enough to deserve it. The first round of these schemes comes from Prime Minister Robert Peel. His government launches public works to keep people employed and moving, hoping to put money into circulation. It sounds fair on paper, but it's brutal in practice. Thousands of starving men and women travel miles across the countryside to reach scattered work sites. They arrive half dead, clutching shovels too heavy for their bones, building roads that lead nowhere in particular. These become known as relief roads, long aimless ribbons of broken rock that begin and end in emptiness. The work is meant to preserve dignity, to stop people from becoming dependent on aid. But you can't eat dignity, and pride doesn't fill the stomach. The body doesn't respond to ideology. People collapse by the roadside, faint mid-swing, or die on the job, their wages unpaid. You can see them along the new tracks being cut into the hills, tools dropped beside them like markers. Those who manage a full day's labour find the pay too little to feed their families even once. Every road built feels like another burial ground in disguise. The hunger is faster than the pay line. Peel tries something else. Maize imported from America. It's meant to undercut food prices and expand supply. Shiploads of yellow corn arrive at Irish ports, but there's one problem: it's unground. Ireland's mills aren't set up for maize, and without proper milling, it turns into a coarse, almost inedible meal. People try to cook it, but it won't soften. It scrapes throats raw, causing sickness and stomach pain. They start calling it Peel's brimstone, because the yellow dust blinds eyes and burns throats. The plan that's supposed to save a nation turns into another cruel joke. Then the government changes hands. Peel is replaced by Lord John Russell's Whig administration, and with it comes a new man at the Treasury, Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan sees the famine differently, not just as a disaster of crops, but as a test of character. He calls it a judgment of God meant to teach the Irish a moral lesson. That single sentence sets the tone for how the next phase of relief will work. Instead of expanding aid, they cut it. Instead of paying living wages, they reduce rates. The idea is that hardship will purify people, remove laziness, and push them towards self-reliance. The problem is, the people they're trying to reform are already lying faint in the mud. Public works continue, but now the pay is smaller and the conditions harsher. Clerks track attendance and output like machines counting grain. If your section of road doesn't meet the quota, pay is docked. There's no understanding that the weak can't move stone fast enough. If you're too slow, you starve faster. The ideological war between help and punishment plays out in the mud and rain. The government fears dependency more than death. Every morning the same sight repeats. Lines of trembling workers, tools resting on shoulders, trudging through sleet to reach whatever patch of useless ground they've been assigned. Some are turned away when inspectors find them too weak to lift a shovel. Others push on until their legs give out. The paperwork must look tidy in London. Tables of numbers, wages paid, progress measured. But those numbers never show the bodies left by the side of the road. In overcrowded fields, fever spreads through the workers. Sweat mixes with rain, and small wounds turn septic. Villages near the projects turn into sick camps. Overworked relief officers plead for more food rations, but the reply always comes the same: no interference with the market. Charles Trevelyan is sure intervention will only make the people weaker. To him, the famine itself is doing moral work. The officials call it efficiency. The people call it slow death. Stories move down the line. A father collapsing mid-shift while his son finishes the quota just to earn a day's pay. A mother walking home empty-handed after being denied wages for failing to meet targets. In Dulo, crowds are forced to march miles through a storm to prove eligibility for meal tickets. Many never make it back. Their bodies mark the path for those who follow. By early 1847, the system starts folding under its own cruelty. Relief roads multiply, but no one can feed the workers who build them. The government finally shifts to soup kitchens, but only after tens of thousands die waiting. Even then, the kitchens close as soon as they're deemed too successful. Dependence, they say, must end. Policies tighten again. Aid stalls. What began as rescue becomes discipline. The whole structure is designed not to feed, but to teach. And the lesson, for most, is that survival has conditions. Public works aimed to save Ireland's poor, but instead drained their last reserves of strength. The famine turns from a natural disaster into a bureaucratic one. Relief becomes punishment handed out on a shovel. Soon, even those who finish the work have nowhere left to go. The next destination is the workhouse, where hunger isn't just endured, it's organised by rule. The workhouse, where hunger turned orderly and hope became a rule to break. You reach the gates and wait in a slow-moving line of faces that barely look alive. The walls rise taller than any church you've seen, stone layered on stone, built to keep the misery inside neat and contained. When you finally step forward, the first question they ask is not your name but your marital status. The answer decides who you'll never see again. Men go to one wing, women to another, children to their own. Only the infants stay with their mothers, at least until they can walk. The rest are handed away through side doors that slam and lock before you can call out. It's meant to be efficient. To those inside, it feels like being erased. The workhouse isn't a prison by law. You can leave any time you like. That's what the rules say. But where do you go? The roof you surrendered to get inside is gone. The land turned over to the landlord before anyone handed you that bowl of soup. The Gregory Clause made sure of that. If you held more than a quarter acre, you didn't qualify for any relief at all. So you gave up what little you had. Some burned their homes themselves, just to prove they owned nothing worth taking. The price of help was homelessness. Once through the gates, order takes over. Silence is mandatory, conversation is controlled. You eat, work and sleep when the bell says so. Every hour has a purpose, even if that purpose is humiliation. The men break stones or scrub floors. The women sew rough fabric or pick oakum, stripped fibres used for ship ropes. The sound of scraping and coughing fills the halls. You don't make friends here. You exchange quick glances and keep moving. Everyone smells of lime wash, wet wool, and hunger. The space meant for 400 people now holds over 1,000. There's a long dormitory lined wall to wall with iron beds, each person granted about 2 feet of space and a thin blanket that never stays warm. The air smells of sweat and sickness. Some nights, the coughing never stops. You wake up to find another bed empty, the body carried out before dawn. There's a cart that makes its round every morning, creaking under the weight of the dead. The driver doesn't call names, he just counts. The pits behind the yard fill slowly, marked by nothing but dirt. Meals come twice a day. Adults get a mix of stirabout, porridge boiled with water and sometimes milk, and, if supplies last, potatoes too bruised for sale. Bread is cut for the children, tea and broth for those on special lists. The broth tastes mostly like water with a whisper of meat, but in here it's still considered luck. The food never fills you, only holds off the shaking for an hour or two. People say the prisoners at Kilmainham get better meals. It's not a joke. It's a fact that passes quietly through the line each morning. The architecture makes sure you never forget your place. Every corridor ends in a locked door and every turn looks the same. Walls painted the colour of ash, narrow windows that barely let in light. Even time feels measured out in grey. Guards walk through, counting heads, reminding you to keep eyes down. The masters speak in rules, not words. The smallest rebellion, talking out of turn, sharing food, comforting someone too long, earns punishment. Solitary rooms wait for the disobedient, cold enough to make your joints ache. Disease finds comfort in this order. Overcrowding turns a single cough into a week of fever. Typhus takes one, dysentery another, and within days the air tastes infected. There's not enough time to move the ill before the next group falls sick. In Dublin, some workhouses triple their intended number. Reports mention rooms so crowded that air can't circulate. You sleep sitting up because there's no space to lie flat. The weak are moved to infirmary wards that resemble morgues more than hospitals. Children suffer differently. They're made to work lighter tasks, sorting rags, carrying buckets, carding wool, but the hunger keeps them small and slow. Their hair thins, skin bruises easily, and eyes grow dull. You can count ribs in every row of shirts. Malnutrition steals years before it steals breath. And for all that labour, the goal isn't survival, it's deterrence. Poverty is treated like a flaw to be corrected. Officials say generosity will breed laziness, so the design of every rule is meant to make staying here worse than starvation outside. Sometimes the people who crawl in at dusk never make it past the entry hall. They die waiting to be signed in, huddled together for warmth. Others are turned away when the wards fill, sent back to the rain with nowhere left to go. Inside, those who remain rehearse the same quiet question. Is it better to starve in freedom or live in this? You start to understand why some families never come at all. For them, dying at home feels like keeping the last piece of dignity. The workhouse ends up standing for 2 ideas at once: shelter and punishment. It's where hunger becomes manageable, counted, and filed into records. And it's where people begin disappearing behind bureaucratic mercy. Each wall is a reminder that compassion in policy can still feel like cruelty in practice. Outside, though, another kind of suffering begins. The cottages are emptying, not because of illness this time, but because landlords have found their easier solution: eviction. One by one, cottages vanish, flattened and scorched, the smoke mixing with the morning fog. They don't fall from neglect, they're torn down on purpose. The reason sounds almost unreal. Landlords have discovered that an empty cabin is cheaper than a living tenant. The new poor law makes them responsible for anyone still starving on their land. So they do the practical thing. They remove the people. No tenants means no tax burden. A strange logic takes hold where eviction counts as fiscal intelligence. Across valleys that once flickered with peat fires, the light goes out, house by house, until only chimneys stand like broken teeth. The process starts with letters, printed formality carried by constables. Then the agents arrive, usually with crowbars and torches. They move fast, tearing down roofs, smashing doors, dragging furniture into the mud. They burn the straw and collapse the walls so that no one can crawl back in after dark. The law doesn't call it brutality. It calls it clearance. The families aren't criminals, they're liabilities. Smoke rises across the hills like the blight returning in another form, this time consuming shelter instead of food. If you're inside, you get a few minutes to gather what you can carry. A blanket, maybe a pot. Everything else belongs to the fire. Some clearances grow so large that whole parishes vanish. Captain Kennedy records nearly 1,000 houses demolished in just a few months, each once home to about 6 people. In Strokestown, the Mayon estate earns its reputation for cruelty. While lobster soup is served in the manor, over 3,000 tenants are forced out in a single year. The burning continues through winter, black smoke mixing with sleet, smudging the sky. In the far west, entire clusters of cottages are destroyed in a single night. By morning, the valley looks like a battlefield, scattered with furniture, broken doors, and barefoot families walking without direction. Newspapers speak in numbers, but the people who watch know them as faces. A mother clutching a bundle so tightly you can't tell if it's food or a child. A grandfather sitting on a pile of stones where his hearth once stood, staring into smoke as if memory might rebuild the walls. When Bishop Thomas Nolte writes that 700 human beings were driven from their homes in one day, no one doubts it. Some police officers are said to have wept as they carried orders they couldn't refuse. In many villages, neighbouring landlords warn against offering space or bread to the evicted. Kindness becomes risky business. Behind the violence hides a simple equation. When relief is paid for by landowners, poverty turns from tragedy into a bill. Eviction becomes a form of accountancy, a way to reduce the number of mouths that cost money. The Poor Law Extension Act makes sure of it, and soon Ireland's legal system gives them a faster weapon, the Encumbered Estates Act of 1849. That one allows indebted landlords to sell their estates outright. Big London investors, untouched by local grief, buy the land for a fraction of its worth. They have no history with the people already living there, and no intention of keeping them. Their profit lies in grazing cattle, not renting to families. The result is simple. Mass clearance follows every sale. Between 1849 and 1854, about 50,000 families lose everything that way. Some landowners claim to act from mercy. A few pay passage to America or Canada, calling it charity. But these voyages come with an invisible price tag. They clear the land permanently. It's easier to buy a ticket for a starving tenant than to feed them through another season. Benevolence looks nearly the same as expulsion when your destination is an ocean away. George Fawcett's estate in 1849 illustrates it neatly. 30 cabins torn down overnight, the tenants scattered while the owner boasts of efficiency. Mercy on paper, misery in the field. As the teardowns spread, the country's shape begins to change. Villages once marked on maps disappear entirely. Police stations record over 200,000 official evictions within 5 years, though everyone admits the real numbers are far higher. Many families don't wait for agents. They surrender what's left of their land voluntarily, knowing refusal will mean worse. Historian Helen Lytton later calls these surrenders precious little voluntary. People leave home before the crowbars arrive, hoping to escape the humiliation. By the time the year turns, what used to be rural Ireland starts to look like open pasture surrounded by silence. Walk through it, and you see what's left behind. Pans half buried in mud, a child's shoe blackened by fire, ribbons caught on the thorns. Smoke lingers in the grass long after the roofs are gone. Each ruin tells the same story of rent unpaid, land repossessed, and the quiet amputation of a community. The roads to the market towns fill with families pushing carts piled high with whatever didn't burn. Some head east toward Dublin, others west toward the coast, chasing rumours of work or soup. The lucky ones find a spot near a relief station. The rest curl against the walls of empty barns, too weak to walk farther. The countryside is dying differently now. Not from disease or famine, but from absence. There are rare exceptions. A few local landlords fight against the tide, offering reduced rents or building temporary cottages, trying to keep their tenants alive. Their names rarely travel far because their actions don't change the statistics. For every small act of mercy, dozens of others strip acres clean. The government counts this as progress. Land consolidation, they call it. The land may improve, but the people dissolve into ghosts who leave no forwarding address. By the end of the decade, entire regions are hollowed out. County Clare, Connaught, Tipperary, all list parishes missing half their residents. The chimneys collapse, weeds filling fireplaces that once smoked with peat. Hunger emptied stomachs first. Now eviction empties Ireland itself. The blight took the crop, the law takes what's left. The roof, the soil, the meaning of home. And for many there's only one direction left to go. The roads that once led to fields now lead to the harbours. The smoke fades into sea mist, and the next chapter begins aboard the ships waiting to take them away. You trade one death for another, land for the sea. You've sold what little you had left, maybe a pig, a coat, or a pot, just enough to pay for a single passage. The ship waits in the harbour, black against the grey sky, ropes creaking, salt stinging the air. People call them coffin ships, but you pretend not to hear it. The name comes from rumour, you tell yourself, but the truth is written in the smell of sickness that already seeps through the boards before you even sail. For many, this vessel isn't escape. It's just the final patch of earth replaced by water. Families pool their coins and hopes together for a single ticket, most selling everything they own. If the landlord is feeling generous or tidy, he pays your way to clear the land permanently. For others, it's neighbours helping neighbours, scraping shillings together in half-secret desperation. America, Canada, anywhere that isn't Ireland will do. Anything that promises land or food, even if it's a promise you'll never live to see. You don't think about distance. The ocean doesn't look that wide from shore. But once the anchor lifts, the sound of chains clanking across timber feels heavier than goodbye itself. Down below deck, the air thickens fast. There's space for 100 souls, but 200 cram in, shoulder to shoulder, children pressed against their parents for warmth. The ship's crew calls it steerage, a fancy word meaning whatever space is left after the cargo's loaded. You're given half a bunk, maybe a board and a straw mat. The first night, you hear someone vomiting in the dark. The second night, you stop counting. The walls sweat from the bodies, condensation dripping like rain indoors. There's barely enough light to see your own hands. The smell becomes its own weather. Salt, waste, sickness, and fear. Food is measured by ration. Hard bread, dried meal, a few spoonfuls per person. Water runs low almost immediately. Buckets double as toilets, and soon the floor itself becomes the same. Disease doesn't walk politely. It runs. Fever spreads first, then dysentery, then typhus. A single cough can take a dozen within days. There's no doctor, no real medicine, just vinegar water and desperate prayers. The sailors shout for order, but the noise below never stops. At night you hear the splash of bodies slid into the sea, wrapped in sailcloth if there's time, naked if there's not. Some passengers whisper a short prayer, others say nothing. There are too many dead to speak for them all. Official tallies recorded 5 to 30% mortality on these voyages. But those numbers come from captains who kept records tidy and believable. The truth carried across from survivor accounts points far higher, sometimes half a ship's passengers gone before the first sight of land. Out of every 100 who boarded, 50 might never climb back to sunlight. At Grosse Isle in Quebec, the quarantine station recorded over 20,000 deaths from fever during 1847 alone. The island became a graveyard built for strangers, each body wrapped nameless beneath stones carved only with numbers. The stones are still there. Morning fog swallows the horizon, and it starts turning into something symbolic. A border between what's behind and what might come next. You watch the mist roll in and think it looks like Ireland's ghost following you out to sea. The fog hides the crew as they haul ropes, hides the faces of the sick as they drift into silence. It hides everything except the sound of waves touching the hull. Each dawn feels less like arrival and more like forgetting. You've traded slow starvation for the chance of drowning, but somehow that feels like hope. Even in that floating misery, small acts of compassion still happen. One man breaks his portion of bread to give to a child not his own. A woman shares a blanket with a fevered stranger. In a year when nations measure help with ledgers, kindness still slips through unnoticed. Far away, across the Atlantic, the Choctaw Nation, people who had survived their own forced death march called the Trail of Tears, donate $170 for Irish relief. They have little themselves, but they recognize the shape of suffering. That gift still travels through history, whispered wherever famine is remembered. After 6 or 8 weeks at sea, sometimes 11, the coastline finally shimmers ahead, faint at first and then painfully clear. Quebec, Boston, New York, names that had sounded like promises when you left now, look foreign and real. The passengers stagger onto the decks, thin and hollow-eyed. For each step that touches land, someone else is being carried off in silence. Some die within hours of seeing shore, undone by the shock of breathing clean air again. The survivors line up at inspection stations where doctors prod, question, and spray vinegar wash on torn clothes. Many are too weak to speak. Their accents mark them instantly. Irish, unskilled, unwanted. And yet they stay. They have nowhere else to go. Those who live move inland or linger near the docks, building small corners of Ireland in places like New York, Philadelphia, and Toronto. Within a few years, every large city carries the echo of this exodus. By 1850, nearly half of America's foreign-born population is Irish. Streets that once smelled of peat now hum with new accents and new resilience. The famine that emptied homes has crossed into an international story. Aid shipments will move in both directions, Donations from Americans, Turks, Indians, even from people who never saw Ireland but understood hunger. What began as decay in a single field now reaches across oceans. The sea has scattered Ireland's grief across continents, but in each port where the coffin ships arrive, something else begins to grow. The passengers, though sick and broken, step into a future wrapped in fog, part death, part survival, and somewhere in between, the first faint signs that hunger's reign is starting to recede. The famine didn't stop. It faded, slow as low tide. The water never rushes out. It just slips away until all that's left are marks in the sand and things no one remembers leaving behind. That's how Ireland looked by the early 1850s. The worst years had passed, but the quiet that followed didn't sound like peace. Fields began to turn green again, the blight retreating almost as suddenly as it had arrived. The harvests improved, enough to feed those who were still alive, but the country itself had changed shape. It wasn't the same land anymore. Too many fields lay empty, too many hands gone. Potatoes started growing well again around 1850, healthy and whole this time. You could dig one up without fear of the smell, but where food returned, people did not. Whole parishes had emptied in the years before. Those who left for Liverpool or Boston rarely came back. What passed for recovery barely registered in the lives of those still here. The land looked healed from a distance, but up close it was scarred. Broken boundaries where cottages once stood, graves where roads now ran. Every field carried ghosts, and every good harvest reminded survivors of who wasn't there to eat. The population never recovered. The census told the story in cold numbers. Over 8 million people in 1841, down to roughly 6.5 million by 1851. 1.5 million lives gone, erased by hunger, disease, and the open sea. The numbers kept falling afterward, not from new famine, but because leaving had turned into habit. Families took passage anywhere they could. America, Canada, Australia, spreading Irish names across oceans. For many, the idea of survival meant escape. Those left behind inherited a quieter, lonelier island. The government's interest in the crisis faded faster than the famine itself. Around 1852, when the crops returned to something like normal, most officials declared the emergency over. Relief programs shut down one after another. Soup kitchens closed. Public works ended. And what was left of state-funded food distribution stalled completely. London was tired of Ireland's need and eager to reduce the cost. Trevelyan himself called the famines close, the operation of natural causes, as if millions dead were nature's bookkeeping. Once again, philosophy replaced charity. That pullback pushed the burden of survival onto neighbours, priests, and scattered local committees who worked with whatever was left. Villages began to look inward. A barrel of seed was shared instead of sold. Fishermen on the coast brought extra catches inland to families they'd never met. Parish relief boards organised meal rotations, passing around what they called subscriptions, small collections of pennies and bread. People helped one another quietly, piecing together scraps of welfare the government no longer wanted to fund. Ireland's relief became a grassroots invention, fueled more by memory than money. By then, the social structure that had once defined the countryside was dissolving. The small tenant farms that built their lives around potatoes disappeared almost entirely. Landlords, encouraged by laws like the Encumbered Estates Act, consolidated holdings into larger farms meant for cattle or grain. The few who stayed on the land found themselves working as labourers rather than tenants, paid in cash instead of crops. It sounded like progress, but it stripped away independence. Rural life shrank, pulled into the hands of fewer and richer owners. Families that had scraped by for generations now worked as hired hands on the property they used to lease. The famine's strange logic meant that the country's recovery depended on absence. With fewer mouths to feed, the same bitter soils could finally sustain those who remained. There was more space, more food, but less of everything else. Less laughter, less community, less faith in the land itself. The fields didn't look empty because they were ruined. They looked empty because there were finally enough potatoes to go around. Recovery didn't arrive through smart policy or compassion. It arrived through subtraction. Government records show Ireland's rural economy stabilising by the early 1850s, but that stability came after collapse. Emigration kept the pressure low. Each ship leaving for Canada or the United States thinned the risk of rebellion at home. The Empire counted that as success. To those left in Ireland, it looked more like surrender. Poverty remained, just more spread out. Wages improved slightly, but prices never stayed still. Children who survived the famine grew up viewing land as temporal and unstable. The oldest generation, the ones who remembered digging through rotten crops, spoke rarely and described the blight as if it were still in the ground. Hunger's retreat brought a strange stillness. Villages that once thrummed with work and children's laughter stood half abandoned. The schools were quiet. Chapels echoed too much. The cowpaths turned to grass because no one walked them anymore. It's one thing for a nation to lose people to war or plague. It's another when the loss lasts generations. The famine didn't only kill, it taught people to leave, to distrust stability, to see migration as survival. That lesson stuck. Even decades later, ships still carried its echo. By 1851, Ireland was smaller in both size and sound. Over a fifth of the country gone, yet no celebration at being free of hunger. The silence said more than numbers ever could. It sat heavy in the morning air, in empty farmhouses and in letters that arrived from America written by hands that no longer trembled from starvation. Life resumed, but slower, more cautious, always glancing backward. The famine didn't really end. It just became quiet enough to mistake for peace. The fields bore food again, the workhouses emptied, and the government moved on. But in that calm, every survivor knew what was missing. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was memory, too heavy to speak aloud. And from that silence, Ireland's future began reshaping itself. A country learning how to live with ghosts, and how to speak softly in a landscape that still remembered the sound of hunger. Even after the hunger passed, the famine stayed, in the land, in the language, and in the way Irish families talked about leaving. The fields might have turned green again, but the memory of their silence never faded. Even now, people call it An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, a name that carries more weight than the word famine ever could. Hunger was only part of it. It was also about loss, of people, homes, and trust. It turned memory itself into an heirloom that every generation kept, sometimes quietly, sometimes as a warning. The famine reshaped who the Irish thought they were and how they saw the world. Before it, Ireland's population was growing faster than any in Europe. After it, the country became a place that exported its people more than its crops. Today, around 80 million people around the world claim Irish descent, most tracing their roots back to that terrible decade. Emigration became a family story passed down through letters and oral traditions, the great divide that turned Ireland into both a home and a memory. You'll still hear stories told at kitchen tables about a great-grandparent who left and never came back, a name whispered across generations because silence was the only thing that could carry that much absence. The hunger also redefined Ireland's relationship with Britain. For many, the famine marked a line between being ruled and being neglected. The dead were gone, but the resentment stayed. Even after independence, decades later, the famine haunted political debates and set a foundation for Irish nationalism. The anger wasn't abstract. It was rooted in the idea that a country could die while another stood by arguing about policy. Generations grew up hearing about it not as history, but as a reckoning that was never properly answered. When the British government finally offered reflection, it came a century and a half later. In 1997, Prime Minister Tony Blair's office acknowledged that those who governed in London at the time failed their people through standing by while a crop failure turned into a massive human tragedy. It wasn't called an apology, but for many it was a start, a quiet, careful bow to a grief that never fully calmed. Walk through Ireland today and you'll still see the famine marked out in bronze, stone and story. In Murrisk, County Mayo, a sculpture of a coffin ship stands frozen in wind, its sails shaped like skeletal ribs. It faces west, toward the ocean that carried millions away. That's the National Famine Memorial, built not to glorify endurance, but to remind visitors that survival always has a cost. Each May, Ireland observes the National Famine Commemoration Day. The ceremonies aren't dramatic. They're hushed, respectful. People standing together in silence, some laying wreaths, others just staring at the horizon. The act of remembering becomes both duty and inheritance. Beyond stone markers, the famine continues in songs, ballads and poetry. Some are sung in Irish, others in English, the words passing quietly from one generation to the next. Old verses about hunger and departure mix with newer ones about exile and pride. The sound of it blurs time, turning sorrow into something communal. Even folk tales hold traces, ghosts wandering fields, boats haunted by unnamed passengers, stories where hunger itself becomes a character. The blight may have vanished from the soil, but it still grows in language. Museums across the country do their part to keep those memories tangible. In Dublin, cork models, eviction notices, and letters from emigrants sit under glass. In County Cork's Cobh Heritage Centre, the exhibits trace the routes of ships that carried the desperate westward. Visitors don't go there for entertainment. They go because somewhere, someone in their family left that same way. History becomes personal the moment you see your last name on a passenger list. Those places aren't just archives, they're confessionals. Sometimes memory finds a shape in compassion. The story of the Choctaw Nation donating $170 to Irish famine relief in 1847 has become one of the most deeply honoured legacies of that period. It wasn't about the sum, it was about empathy. The Choctaw people had just survived their own forced march, the Trail of Tears, and still chose to send aid across the ocean to strangers. That gesture planted a seed that keeps growing. In recent years, Ireland returned the kindness, sending aid to Native American communities struggling with modern crises. One act of generosity from 1847 still ripples through the present like a tide that never ebbs out completely. The famine marked Ireland's voice not only in remembrance but in resilience. The diaspora built entire lives abroad while carrying the hunger as part of their identity. Irish communities in Boston, New York, Toronto and Sydney carried the same songs that were once whispered over empty plates. They built churches and neighbourhood halls named after home, turning memory into architecture. You can trace a direct line from the famine's grief to the pride that fills St. Patrick's Day parades around the world. That celebration, born of exile, always carries an undertone of endurance, the kind that refuses to fade no matter how much time passes. Standing in a quiet field in the west of Ireland today, the silence sounds different from the silence that began this story. Where once there was hunger and decay, now there's grass, wind, and the sound of names being remembered aloud. The famine never left, because it wasn't only a tragedy, it was a teacher. It showed how policy could starve a nation, and how memory could outlive it. What began as silence has become remembrance. What once was despair has turned into continuity. You've walked through hunger, loss, and endurance. Now you understand what survival feels like when a country learns to carry its scars with grace. Hunger ended, but empathy didn't. And maybe that's the real inheritance Ireland passed on to the world. Hunger recedes, but empathy has to remain. The Great Hunger wasn't caused by nature alone, it was shaped by policy and indifference. As Tony Blair later said, those who governed in London at the time failed their people through standing by, while a crop failure turned into a massive human tragedy. That failure didn't just belong to history, it's a warning. Every nation depends on fragile systems, and every crisis tests how much we value one another. The question now is simple. After everything Ireland endured, how certain are we that we'd never stand by and let hunger happen again? Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this brief stroll through history. Remember to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy what I do here. I bid you farewell and wish you a pleasant trip on your way to dreamland.